The following lecture, Colin Wilson, a Retrospective, was prepared by the lecturer Howard F Dossor following the death of Colin Wilson on the 5th of December 2013. Howard Dossor is the author of the study Colin Wilson, The Man and His Mind, published by Element Press in the United Kingdom in 1990. He is a freelance writer and a regular lecturer with the Existential Society in Melbourne. Here is Howard Dossor.
In 1985, a collection of essays by Colin Wilson I had gathered together under the title The Bicameral Critic, and for which I had written an introduction headed Colin Wilson, The Case for Optimism, was published by Ashgrove Press in the United Kingdom. It contained an important essay entitled Civilization and Individual Fulfillment, a title that instantly takes us to the central theme of Colin Wilson's life and work. His entire body of work might well be defined as a treatment of this dual-edged theme. At a launching of the book at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Professor of English Derek Marsh referred back to 1956 and the heady days of the publication of Wilson's first volume, The Outsider. I remember, recalled Marsh, that everyone was rushing about insisting they were outsiders. Not a little of the appeal of Wilson's first book may well have been attributable to a sentence that occurs on page 15, which declared that the outsider is a man who sees too deeply and too much. Thus, anyone who perceived himself, and the respondents were overwhelmingly male, as a legitimate critic of his social and cultural settings, felt that he had at last been recognised as being something of an intellectual. The notion of seeing one's self over against an impersonal world appeared to be very attractive. Many thought it most pleasing to be bracketed with luminaries such as Fyodor Dostoevsky, Hermann Hesse, Friedrich Nietzsche, and the many others surveyed in Wilson's volume. As a consequence, the response to The Outsider was probably more visceral than intelligent. The reader sensed that these pages expressed something of real significance and urgency, but the extent to which its treatment of civilization and individual fulfillment was grasped may be open to debate. The fact is that Wilson, with objective and critical insight, and as a response to the extraordinary extent and depth of reading in one so young, had identified a major theme running through much of Western literature. This was the theme of alienation, experienced by sensitive and thinking individuals who found it difficult to live within a culture that seemed to them to be based on insensitivity and mindlessness. The book was intended not so much as a definition of the outsider as a study in the disconnect between individual sensitivity and collective insensitivity. The fifth chapter of The Outsider is entitled The Pain Threshold, and this was the title under which the entire manuscript was written. It was also Wilson's preferred title. It was his publisher, Victor Galanx, who persuaded him that the work should bear the title The Outsider. But Wilson's title is much more indicative of his purpose in writing the book. He wished to describe the nature of the alienation experienced by his subjects. He sought to illustrate the fact that the inevitable result of any attempt to live as a sensitive in an insensitive environment must result in a level of pain that will sometimes express itself in antisocial or anti-personal behaviour, including crime and suicide. One well understands Galanx's reservation over that title, for it is lacking in commercial appeal, but the choice of The Outsider was, as an alternative, was equally problematical, for it tended to draw attention away from Wilson's purpose. The chief problem with the title Galanx preferred lay in its exclusive nature. If one is outside, one must be outside something, and it is clear that the individuals in Wilson's study were outside the mainstream of established cultural heroes and social values. They were critical of the establishment and of the status quo. They could make no sense of, and therefore could find no comfort in, the organisation and behaviour of their fellow men. At one level, then, the work was open to misinterpretation as an arrogant assault on those in authority or those who represented prevailing values. Inevitably, confronted with the critique of Wilson's assembled witnesses, the establishment and the status quo grouped together to retaliate. And by the time Wilson had published his second volume, Religion and the Rebel, an attack upon him was in full force. The plaudits heaped on his first work were repudiated under a vicious rejection of this new young upstart. He was widely dismissed in the jargon of the day as an egghead. More tellingly, he was ridiculed as being an autodidact, an accusation that gave clear expression to the proprietary attitude of the establishment. Wisdom, they implied, belonged exclusively within their province. Only those with a recognised university education were qualified to challenge the prevailing order. Significantly, few critics addressed the substance of either book, even failing to see the most obvious fact that they constituted a single work. The attack, from the beginning, assumed the form of an argumentum ad hominem that exposed the small-mindedness of the critics and suggested that they were defending themselves rather than any intellectual position they might have espoused. The abuse directed at him was itself illustrative of the very problem he had so clearly defined, a mindlessness that oozed frustration. Aged a mere 25, Wilson was clearly vulnerable to the attack. He trailed a failed first marriage. His decision to sleep on Hampstead Heath in order to save money while writing his treatise was used to suggest that he was being simply ostentatious. Even his dress habits were noted disparagingly as if they were an affectation. A well-meant but careless article by his friend Daniel Farson in the Daily Mail, which Farson deeply regretted having published, suggested that Wilson might be little more than a self-promoting egotist. accusations of fascist inclinations levelled against him were as offensive as they were inaccurate. They compounded Wilson's philosophical interest in Hitler's aberrant psychology into an embrace of his politics. In keeping with this abuse, Wilson himself soon came to be branded with the title of his book and universally designated an outsider, as if his writings were a description of his own persuasions. Certainly he had affinities with those he wrote about, but the extent to which he was outside the mainstream was not what most defined him. In fact, he was an objective, original, and accurate recorder of a stream of people who felt uncomfortable with life as they experienced it, life which did not accord with their furthest vision, their deepest desires, or their highest values. And it must be acknowledged that by any reasonable literary standard, the outsider succeeds in meeting its objective. Further, in the second volume of this singular work, Wilson proposed a solution to the dilemma experienced by these individuals. What is necessary, he concluded, was some form of religious revival. But here, Wilson was not thinking of organised religion in any traditional sense, far from it. He was thinking of the dormant spirituality that lies at the core of humanity and that has been either suppressed or institutionalised over the centuries. He was thinking of a reawakening and utilisation of human intuition as a corrective to irrational thinking and as a crucial complement to rational thought. He was thinking of the power and role of the applied imagination. He was thinking of the creation of a sensitive society that ordered itself in accord with what is best described as the essential nature of man, rather than as a free-for-all in which the greedy predominate and the weaker are manipulated beyond endurance. But more particularly, Wilson was arguing for a re-examination of the very nature of human consciousness, arguing that we need to appreciate it more fully and live in compliance with its highest manifestations. In his observation, most of us live the life of a robot, responding like automatons to external stimuli or animalistic instincts, rather than responding to the higher levels of awareness. We live without sufficient regard to the relational and intentional characteristics of consciousness. In taking this backward glance at the outsider and religion and the rebel, we would do well to note that within a decade of their publication, Wilson wrote Beyond the Outsider, which bore the subtitle The Philosophy of the Future. While affirming the integrity of the set of volumes that has been referred to as the Outsider cycle, it needs to be acknowledged that when judged from the perspective of the positive contribution made by Wilson, the later books in the cycle are of much more significance than the earlier volumes. Whereas the early works define a problem, the later books move towards a viable solution, and the same can be said of every Wilson title produced subsequently. The cycle might well be regarded as a record of Wilson's own developing mind, although we can be confident that the roots of the last volume were already in place when he set out to write the first volume. Contemporary friends such as Bill Hopkins, Tom Greenwell and Alfred Reynolds, who knew him well, have testified in personal interviews that Wilson thought well ahead of the game. Much reference has been made over the years to Wilson's writing as being undisciplined and careless. But might one not expect in the work of a man who has written well over 100 volumes that a reasonable number of mistakes might be found? If we are justified in expecting serious writers to identify possible pathways through the labyrinth of confusion and uncertainty in which we exist, should we not focus on what they accomplish rather than on a set of puerile standards by which to condemn them? Are any writers flawless in their craft, in their interpretation of experience, or in their speculation? Should they not constantly challenge mindlessness wherever they encounter it? Denounce the thoughtlessness that pervades our culture? Is it not their responsibility to address the critical issues that underlie every aspect of the revolutionary age through which we are passing? These were clearly the parameters within which Wilson worked every morning in the solitude of his study and in the crucible of his mind. Are we not under a profound obligation to him for his intellectual industry? One effect of these considerations is the supposition that Wilson's first volume might better have been called The Thinker. Such a title might have protected him against the nature of the attack that was sustained against him. It could have averted the stigma of a lopsided judgment and made it unequivocally clear that Wilson was writing about the value of thinking. Certainly, the volume is an important study in the pain of the thoughtful man as he contemplates the mindlessness that seems to pervade contemporary living. Wilson was not, nor did he seek to become, a guru. He had no need for disciples. Yet a vast readership sought out his works, and he was among the most widely borrowed authors in the British lending library system. He was translated into at least 12 languages, and no other English writer matches the esteem with which he is regarded in Japan, where most of his works are available in Japanese translations. He received a huge correspondence, and the extent to which he responded to letters and emails was a constant source of wonder to those who sought him out. By and large, he thought the breadth of his interests across a wide range of disciplines made it difficult for readers to comprehend him. Yet, each of his publications, in whatever genre, fiction, psychology, crime and archaeology among them, found its own considerable audience. Among a random group of 50 of his readers, it is likely that 30 of his titles would be selected as being among the most important of them. Young and old, male and female, and people of all countries found unequalled value in him. In relation to his literary production, Wilson is in no need of any apologist. we do not sit in judgment on him. His work has the profound effect of assessing us, by providing a yardstick with which we might measure our intelligence and the legitimacy of our philosophical vision. In a world where almost every feature of living, from education to sport, and including law, health, and the arts, has been transmuted into a commercial commodity, and in which values have become mired in materialism, Wilson challenges us to think in higher terms. In a global village in which literally millions of individuals are acutely aware that life is barely being sustained at well below optimal standards, Wilson unerringly identifies a point at which remedial action might begin to redress our plight. Political, religious, social, and even cultural programs will avail nothing unless there is a meaningful modification in the application of our intellect and an authentic awakening of consciousness. Nor does Wilson need any eulogist. Whatever the degree of pain he might have suffered at the hands of his critics, he endured it with extraordinary fortitude and persisted with his work. He spoke more than eloquently for himself. He wrote with confidence and clarity about the most important issues confronting mankind's psychological condition today, a weakening of the will and a sliding into a debilitating apathy. What he sought, what he passionately desired, was an intelligent response to his work and a dialogue with others who shared his concern for a world and a human enterprise that seemed to be drifting aimlessly. Nothing pleased him more than the cut and thrust of genuine debate, although he did not suffer fools gladly, and he could never be satisfied with the peripheral or the superficial. Wilson's focus on and examination of the nature of human consciousness gave him insight into a wide range of human behaviour. He comprehended that the study of consciousness held the key to understanding, among other things, crime, mental illness, religious pathology, and the sense of lethargy that seems to be the chosen lot of so many. The indifference threshold, as he called it, was to be seen operating in every sphere of human activity as the inevitable construct of a disengaged consciousness. His contribution in each of these designated fields has been groundbreaking. Contrary to the widely canvassed view that he simply regurgitated the views of others, the evidence shows that he took the work of others and added to it in very significant ways. An example of this is the manner in which he contradicted the findings of Abraham Maslow, who believed that the peak experience could not be induced at will. Wilson argued in his writing and demonstrated in his life that the peak experience was open to all those who wished to experience it and were willing to exert their will to achieve it. Again, Wilson took the key philosophical concepts of prehension and intentionality, as expounded by Alfred North Whitehead and Edmund Husserl respectively, and, after making them intelligible to a much wider readership than either Whitehead or Husserl could ever have hoped for, made them cornerstones in his explication of the nature of consciousness. He wrote with a rare communicative skill that many other writers would happily sacrifice a great deal to possess. Three of the more emotive areas to which Wilson turned his attention were human sexuality, mental health, and the crime of murder. In relation to the first, he expounded on the origin, nature, and influence of the sexual impulse, offered profound and comprehensible advice to intelligent teenagers trying to come to grips with the strongest urge they had yet experienced, and analysed the psychology of the sexual misfit, of whom there is a part in every one of us. In an age where an undercurrent of sexual tension courses beneath most world cultures, Wilson offers a cautionary and yet encouragingly healthy note. The exponential increase in mental illness in modern cultures, whether drug-induced or in the form of dementia or other manifestations, stands in need of a greater awareness and application of Wilson's insight into the place of the will in a normally functioning life. In setting out new pathways in psychology, as he did in his book of that title, he did more than simply explicate the theories of Maslow. He identified psychological principles and precepts that go to the core of analysis and remediation. His studies in the criminology of the murderer, especially the serial killer, are simply breathtaking in the depth of their insight. In any genuinely inquiring criminology curriculum, his writings on crime should feature largely in its reading list. Both judges and potential jurors stand to benefit from a reading of his analysis of the mind of the murderer, who all too often manifests the characteristics of the outsider. Had length not precluded it, a chapter on the criminal mind would have been included in The Outsider. Fortunately, it eventually became available as the introduction to an encyclopedia of murder, jointly authored by Wilson and Patricia Pittman. From 1970, following an invitation from Random House to write a book on the occult, Wilson devoted much of his thought and writing to an explanation of the mysteries that confound our comprehension of life's meaning. Much of this work was speculative and open to argumentation, as such work by its very nature must always be. But it was always an acknowledgement that life is a boundless domain of unrealised potential, and that human imagination has a central role to play in the future development of the species. Significantly, many who rejected his books on the occult responded positively to his highly entertaining and perceptive science fiction, which used powerful symbolism to argue for man's innate capacity. The Mind Parasites is, by any objective judgment, a major novel. As a young man, Wilson might well have been described as a romantic. Certainly few have identified the heart of romanticism with as much clarity as he did. But as he moved through his teenage years, he moved beyond romanticism and escaped its traps. I recall his insisting to me as we walked around the Dodman Point on the Cornish coast that it's not all about love, Howard, it's about control. For a period, he was attracted to the existentialists, but he soon recognised the negativity that lay at the heart of thinkers like Sartre and Camus, and compared it to a poison that had been dispersed into our drinking water. He fashioned what he called a new existentialism, not a philosophical system, but an intellectual perspective through which one could interpret experience and utilise it in one's personal development. At the heart of the new existentialism lies the antidote to the abuse of the intellect, the universal propensity to see intelligence as an instrument to be applied in the construction or formulation of profit-making merchandise or ideas, demonstrates how we value intellect in terms of financial outcomes rather than human achievement. The new existentialism celebrates the questing mind that seeks to penetrate the unknown and generate the next revolutionary stage in the evolution of mankind. Yet it is much more than an intellectual exercise. It is an engagement with life in an intense intentionality, a wrestle with reality in an attempt to make it yield more of its secrets. In his 1963 publication Eagle and Earwig, Wilson produced another key essay under the title Existential Criticism. In it, he spelled out a methodology for examining all of our experience, including our reading. Ultimately, he wrote, the existential critic wishes to know precisely what a book is saying, not whether it is true to life or tells its story well. In order to be capable of pronouncing on this, he requires a certain standard of meaning. This meaning is not moral, religious, or political. It is meaning in the broadest and deepest sense. A thing means something because of the relation it bears to our lives. In this context, irrelevance and meaninglessness are the same thing. Existential criticism, he concluded, is an attempt to develop this standard of meaning. Wilson recognised that in developing a standard of meaning, one actually increases the degree of meaning attached to one's life. The existential search for meaning is the antidote to the robotic, trance-like state in which most people spend the greater part of their lives. It recognises and celebrates the relationship that exists between the individual and the whole of reality. It is a utilisation of the relational nature of consciousness. It provides a basis for an absolute engagement with life and a wholehearted clenching of that experience which actualises our potential. Meaning was the compass by which Wilson sought to steer his course throughout his entire life. And it was to be explored, he knew, through both the intellect and intuition simultaneously. From the opening sentence of The Outsider, at first sight, the outsider is a social problem, to the closing paragraph of his final publication, Superconsciousness, every sentence he wrote was a product of existential criticism. It was the vital methodology for his inquiring mind and a pathway through the most complex dimensions of his curiosity. The critical response to the life and work of Colin Wilson is salutary. While his careful readers salute him in the most glowing terms and declare their indebtedness to him for his contribution to their self-knowledge and self-development, his detractors continue to abuse his personality with dismissive disdain. In this he is not in isolation. Another major intellectual of the 20th century, the poet, novelist and philosopher Kretes Nikos Kazantzakis, is held equally and paradoxically with acclaim and derision across the world. Significantly, in both cases, the loudest voices seem to come from among those who demonstrate little evidence of actually having read the respective texts. Certainly, the establishment within Greece, as exemplified in its Orthodox Church and its academic elite, has sought largely to curtail the influence of Kazantzakis because he did not conform to established dogmas. There seems to be a forbidding bounty placed on the work of original and challenging thinkers. We have become comfortable in our ignorance and lazy in our investigative responsibilities. Wilson and Kazantzakis, it must be affirmed, are not simply men of our time. They transcend time and place. Their true place is within the ongoing intellectual enterprise that constitutes the cutting edge of humanity's quest for its own future. This is because, as suggested by Oswald Mosley in his 1957 review of The Outsider, they touched reality. Men such as these emerge out of history only rarely, and when they do, it behooves their contemporaries to heed well what they have to say. They are both diagnosticians and prescribers who assess our disease and offer us reliable remedies. It is impossible to believe that in 100 years from now, the works of both men will be read by individuals with inquiring minds who will not be able to comprehend the degree to which these genuine philosophers, intellectual visionaries with heightened intuitive sensibilities, were subjected to disregard in their own age. Wilson was not, nor ever sought to be, a member of the English literary establishment. In many respects, that was his strength. But that does not justify the insensitivity with which the establishment treated him during his writing career. Beyond question, he contributed as much, if not more, to his nation's cultural heritage as did such acclaimed writers as Graham Greene, George Orwell and Evelyn Waugh, and such recognised philosophers as Bertrand Russell, A.J. Ayer and George Moore. England could and should redress its failure in this regard, at least to some extent, by giving him due posthumous recognition. Wilson kept a voluminous journal in a series of bound volumes. He also maintained an extensive oral journal. It is well known that there are at least 2 completed manuscripts ready for publication. The first of these is a huge sequel to his novel The Space Vampires, which bears the title The Metamorphosis of the Vampires, and a part of which has been translated into Russian and published in that country. There is also a volume on the Identity of Shakespeare. One hopes for the posthumous publication of all or any of these volumes. Many readers will be fervently hoping that a fifth volume of the superb Spider World sequence might be found in finished form, tucked away in a filing cabinet or desk drawer. As a writer, Wilson displayed great aptitude at creating and using the aphorism. Again and again, he encapsulated in a single sentence a complex and profound idea so that it struck home its meaning in the awareness of the reader with enormous force. 3 examples, all having to do with the nature of consciousness, will suffice to demonstrate this. What we accept as everyday consciousness is thoroughly subnormal. Freedom is a quality of consciousness. Perception itself is a creative act. An anthology of his aphorisms would provide at the one time both a thought-provoking summary of his oeuvre and a set of inspirational readings. On a personal level, Wilson was among the most personable of individuals. He was generous to a fault. I have in my collection a total of 152 introductions that he has contributed to the publications of other writers. And without exception, these are encouraging with regard to new writers and affirmative with respect to established authors. His home was open to countless visitors, many of whom made excessive demands upon him, but none of whom he turned away. The support he received from his wife, Joy, was steadfast and immediately visible to all who saw them together. He lectured frequently in England, the United States, Japan, Australia, and elsewhere, often without a fee, and few who heard him went away without being stimulated and challenged. He shunned literary prizes and awards because he believed they were an inappropriate response to the obligation of the writer to share his insights. He spurned negative writing and insisted that it was the duty of the writer to inspire and to encourage. For him, literary pessimism was a sign of laziness. Several of the obituaries published following his death suggest that he was a heavy drinker, but in approximately 20 visits to his home, and while accompanying him during 3 visits to Australia, I never saw him even mildly under the influence of alcohol. He had no need of chemical stimulants. His mind was a wide open gateway into the fullness of life. Almost anybody who ever came upon him became aware of the extent to which his mind was engaged. He was not given to small talk or to existential drift. He sought to direct his own life through the exercise of his consciousness, and the whole of his writing is, above everything else, an account of his own struggle with himself as he sought to create a constructive way forward, both as an individual and as a member of the human race. Wilson understood that one does not go out into the world to find oneself. One creates oneself continuously through the exercise of the mind in the moulding and interpreting of experience. His wisdom consisted in his recognition that each answer must become a new question, and he lived perpetually on the frontier of the next question. Those who turn to the enduring works of Colin Wilson today with a genuinely open mind cannot fail to be enriched by the sheer vitality of his creative thinking, or to benefit from the extraordinary range of insights he has bequeathed to us. To diminish or ignore his contribution is to deprive ourselves of a significant part of the essence of our fragile humanity. He was, irrespective of what his detractors might claim, simply one of the genuinely great minds of the 20th century. To embrace his life and work is to be drawn towards the higher levels of individual attainment that he advocated, and to increase our personal capacity to contribute to the enhancement of civilization.